limit. A measure of containment and capacity. The word loading, merging with the word limit, that sets boundaries, defines the maximum load that any vessel, land, and air vehicle can safely carry. Inspection of the loading limit prolongs the service time of the highways. Because the load weighs on from axles to tires, must remain on a certain limit. In case of the exceeding of these limits, local collapses can be seen due to the flexibility of the asphalt material. This concept is used in daily life in the case of the exceed of personal or spatial capacity. For example, when someone consumes food excessively, it means that person is over the loading limit. Hello and welcome. We are the Ambiguous Standards Institute. Our main mission or description as an institute is that we have seen that the cryptic, fluid, and fragmented structure of everyday life requires certain ambiguous descriptions, instructions, and standards. The definitions of ambiguous standards are made using ingredients, spatial data, anatomic references, thus loaded categories. Given the standards announce proximity, not certainty, related to the dimensions of the notions they signify. Most of them are qualitative instead of quantitative, thus difficult to investigate solely through physico-mathematical methods and analysis. Ambiguous Standards Institute traces the roots of ambiguous standards in a given context. It aims for the accumulation, information, and the local, national, and global dissemination of thereof. The Institute pursues a delicate investigation of textual and visual representations of various exo-standard measurements and takes them into the record. Some of these standards refer to physico-social and some to physico-mathematical practices. Some are ambiguous by nature, some are absolute by self-proclamation, meaning that they are defined by the social and cultural environment they are situated in. Some are frequently used, and some are long out of circulation. Compilation of information is distributed the mission through various channels of mass media.
Okay. Welcome everyone. Thank you for listening us today, being with us. I'm Cansu from the Institute, and we wanted to start this conversation by having a look of Nicola's work first and discussing a little about the definition of these concept loading limits. So this is basically where we are as an institute. We are dealing with these standardization of our daily life measurements. The Ambiguous Institute is, maybe we can summarize as a design debate initiative based in Istanbul, dealing with the latent or secondary impulses of the standards on our designed environments. And we are particularly focusing on the effects of standardization on our daily life and shaping the everyday objects. We started as a duo, together with Avşar and I, a couple of years ago by listing the non-universal, mostly local, verbal and cultural daily life standards embedded in our culture. So these are the words that describes, represents mostly physical equivalences or analogies between the appearances and the amounts of the goods, as they mostly function based on the 4 principles of representation defined by Aristotle and later philosophers. These principles are analogy, identity, similarity, or opposition. So we are using these principles to understand the design environments as a part of our standardized words. But in between these relations, ambiguities emerge. take a recipe of a cake, for example. When we prepare the formula, we actually base the recipe on these ambiguous standards like a sip, a tad, just a piece, a small amount. But then the recipe almost magically works. So as a initiative, design initiative, we actually started to collect these words first of all. And at the end, today we reach out 300 ambiguous standards. We listed them, illustrated them, and then our collection of words emerged to the collection of design objects. And for the last design biennial, organized by İKSV and happened to be here in Pera Museum last year, we designed 6 crated crates, all of which contains design debates accumulating these ambiguous standards, concentrating on the quotidian objects such as kitchen utensils, time measurement objects, tea glasses, egg holders and eggs, etc. So our collection derives from words to the design objects. Now we are working on different areas of these of this design debate of standards, let's say. Maybe you can show up some of the images. Let's finish them together. Let's continue with the okay.
So the main idea was it has started with daily expressions, words we use in everyday life. Then slowly it has turned out that the standards are not only present on measurement tools or in books, but in the daily language, in every aspect of the world. There are these hyper objects affecting all kinds of other objects, including human beings. But on the other hand, maybe we can come to yes. We have seen that a long part of the human history has passed without these main institutions of standardization. We see that especially late 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, certain national or international institutions began to be established to kind of ease up the commerce process or come up with a specific grading, normalization and standardization system so that the flow of goods and money and people and all kinds of objects becomes much more easier.
I can help.
Okay. And this is only a fraction of all the words or concepts used for weighing things. Because globalization is quite older than we think, like the Ottoman Empire trading with the Venetians or Genovites, they have to come up with certain conversion tables between different types of measurements. So for the calculation of or measurement of the weight of things, there has been hundreds of different words used in the world. But when we move to a kind of a non-physical or metaphysical universe, first we should see that how we came up with the idea of a kilogram. So the first idea was to take something from the nature and equalize it to 1 kilogram, so that everyone can use the same thing.
A piece of ice.
A piece of 0.1 cubic meters of water. is equals to 1 kilogram. But then we realized that the weight of water changes a lot. So we come up with a new idea that in late 19th century we equal it to a piece of mass, kind of another weight.
Yeah.
And for around a century it stays like that. So the weight of everything is related to the weight of another object.
Yeah.
But when we come to the 21st century in 2019, we decide to change this as well, because that weight, our standard weight, is actually losing weight. Only about the weight of an eyelash, but still. So we equalize it to the Planck constant, or we tie it to the Planck constant, so we can calculate it, or we can be sure about its 1 kilogramlessness to a very microscopic degree, so to say. How these standards and how the objects in the world relate to each other, how standards are not only standards, can be visualized through a very basic example.
Yeah.
The journey of an egg from the rear of a chicken to our tables. So it gets out of the rear of the chicken and it goes into a viol. And this should have a certain shape to accommodate the egg. And the viol goes into another carton box, that box goes into another box, and multiple boxes come onto a pallet. They go into a container, which also has a very specific standard, which goes into a big ship, and then again, going smaller and smaller, it goes into the supermarket, then into the refrigerator, and onto the
our tables.
onto our tables and the egg holder. So when we talk about weights or any standard of weight or length or whatsoever, we are talking about not just the standards themselves, but this whole infrastructure and the whole network of relations tying them together. As an institute, we do not produce artworks, but we just design tangible objects to have these discussions around different topics. But here we have two artists with us who work with standards in general in a different way. So they process this information and come up with different notions, different types of, let's say, objects. And the first one is Nicola. The video we have watched is done and shot by him. So we would like to throw the ball to you, and in general, how do you relate to the collection here? And how does it overlap with your artistic practices?
Yeah. Hello everyone, thanks for being here. So I'll try to explain a bit how my interest for the collection, which is the Anatolian Weights and Measures collection, started, and somehow I engaged with it at what I came up at the end. So it all started when about 2 years ago, Ulia Soleil, which is the curator, mentioned me the collection as something that could be of my interest, and she was telling me about these 10,000 items produced in basically 4,000 years of history. And so in a sense this sort of resonated in my mind for a while, until the point that I decided to come to Istanbul and visit the collection. And for some reason I was expecting huge buildings storing all these 10,000 items. In fact, the archive is quite small, because most of these items are fairly small objects, little weight, with the shape of ducks and little glass pieces. So I was quite surprised by how all this material was condensed in this little space. And all my research somehow happened at a distance because I wasn't here. So in a sense, I dealt with the collection almost like if it was a landscape, if I was supposed to work with the landscape but without being there. And I think this allowed quite a lot of speculation in relating to it. And since the beginning, something that I really found fascinating was the fact that somehow all these objects were a sort of photograph of human effort and struggle to somehow define things, give like relationships between things, like somehow to understand what is outside, giving some sort of measures and techniques. And so since the beginning I didn't want to focus on a specific aspect or object like in the collection, but rather into this sort of dense accumulation of characters, moods, and like figures and materials and surfaces. So like trying to navigate into it, like without really like considering this object is coming from this exact time, it's meant to be used for this. So I was more interested in this sort of emotional understanding of it. So I started like collecting images and stories. At the beginning I was quite interested in like also sort of punishments given to people that weren't respecting these measures. There is a lot about that. And at some point I crossed like upon a bit. Mm-hmm. You can go back. Mm-hmm. Like two news, basically, like two stories. One was exactly like the redefinition of the kilogram model, so like this platinum-iridyum object conserved in Paris under these 3 layers of glasses closed like with 3 different keys that in 130 years basically lost a little weight, so it got consumed, and all the scientists were like a bit worried, you know, like this might be disappearing or it might get stolen if something happens. So they kind of wanted to make this immortal in a sense, so find a way to have this kilogram relying not on a physical object but on this constant, which is something which is absolute in a sense. And on the other side, I found this news about this professor from the University of California basically trying to figure out the actual physical weight of the internet, like calculating all the electrons, making it possible in this exact moment. That was about like 50 grams, so the weight of a medium-sized egg. Then we were like wondering which egg, because it's not a like defined standard. And of course also in this case I find quite absurd that, you know, like the internet is really much, and we know that like relying on physical infrastructures like databases, and you know it can even be bitten by a shark. This is like a cable bitten by a shark. So like these two things, like this egg that was like basically the internet, and this eyelash that was the weight lost by the model, you know, it started becoming the background of my research and my approach with to the collection. And in this sense, there is something that I think slowly became quite important for the research I developed, and what I'm also working on at the moment. So basically, the internet, you know, we know gave a sort of possibility of breaking certain separation and walls between different fields of knowledge, and it's very easy to access like very serious information and then very stupid movies about cats falling or whatever, like how to fix your bathtub which is broken, like all these things. So we slowly started like to mutate our, I guess, perceptual separation between fields and knowledge and contexts that are apparently distant in time and space. And I think now, with all this sort of climate and human crisis we are facing, and so we are sort of like reconsidering our position in terms of like anthropocentric understanding of this planet, we started like questioning also like very Western model of thought, like relating to like this is bad, good, like this is natural, this is animal, this is artificial, and so on. So we started sort of as well like breaking this strict separation of opposites, And I think somehow the internet prepared for this crisis. It is something I'm quite interested in it. And I think the important thing about this is like that also this allows to probably access history and time not as purely linear phenomena. And so in a sense, I think in this context, I also approach the collection as something quite horizontal rather than a very linear development of like specific techniques and measures. So I think this was quite important to like deal with these things without like fetishizing them or like without really knowing what it was in front of me, but just like approaching this human phenomenon in a sense. And so the installation includes like the video that you saw, and also this full installation made with mainly parts of using sand and using deer bones. And I wanted to talk a bit about the material aspect of it. And I kind of started to work with sand like a couple of years ago, and then lately I kind of slowly started to dig into it. And there is really something that fascinates me about it, which is the fact that sand is at the basis of like every human civilization, basically the pyramids, but it's also like the third like element consumed by humans after water and air, and it is at the basis of every like digital devices that we use. And Silicon Valley, in fact, it refers to silicon that comes from silica, which is basically sand. So like the silicon used in chips, it's basically 90% coming from sand. So there is something about this circle that sort of fascinates me, and the fact that these are basically like sand smugglers, like stealing sand, and sand is becoming the sort of this beginning of humanity, but also like this sort of it's becoming really economical, and this is very material thing that can be stolen and sold, and it is involved in a very complex system. So I started using it. Well, these are some works I did using sand that are not in the exhibition, but somehow like happened just before, so I think there is a bit of connection with that. These are basically fabrics made using sand. And then another material that I started like use specifically for this exhibition, it's basically bonds, and especially like coming from this specific bone, which is the astragalus, which is this little bone which is in the feet of animals, and it's basically this, I have a little one here, which is this little one, and it's so small, but it's basically like this bone that accumulates all the weight of the animal, and I believe it's sort of like, of course it's the physical weight of the body and the stress like of the articulations, but it seems also like a sort of black box somehow condensing some sort of existential weight, I suppose. So, and many of the weights in the collection.
Nicola, is this from the collection?
No, this is a real bone. And many like weights in the collection have this shape, which is quite fascinating, because at the beginning these bones were used like as like basically dices, like to play, and they had some sort of spiritual values, and they are also meant to be like the first money ever used. Like, so also these somehow incorporate a set of like sort of spiritual, animal, economical sort of structures, which is something I'm very much fascinated with. And it's interesting how exactly many objects in the collection refer to this shape. So I started like working with deer bones, like also the rest, not just these, but like there's another work which is not here, but you can see the exhibition, which is made using these bones, somehow recreating another sort of animal figure. And so I think these elements somehow became this sort of cables, I don't know how to say, but like somehow linking to all these little objects, somehow gathering all these experiences. So this was like to give a sort of general idea of how I approach the collection and my sort of concerns about it, and what was like sort of relevant for me in relation to this specific context.
Okay. Thank you, Nicola. For the first round of the conversation, we are continuing with Gülşah, but before that, I'd like to highlight some of the parts that you mentioned, maybe to connect to your research. You talk about sand and how it is being widely used in Silicon Valley to make the silicons so that we can actually define the spirit of our era is internet, and it only weighs 50 grams. Before that, we were just discussing in the popular culture, of course, we were discussing the weight of a human soul. It's 21 gram, and there's popular movies about that. So it's also quite interesting to weigh some of the unphysical phenomena of life. Passing through that, we first open up your presentation with this image of the kilogram, this platinyum-iridyum mass, which is a physical object, and also it's a design object in our sense. A very, very simple shape, but probably the most, how do you say, calculated design object, one of the most calculated design objects in the world. And it has kind of this value, the holistic holiness in its side. And the protection of this small mass is quite striking when you see this picture especially. It's been presented under 3 layers of vacuumed environment. And even this measures the cautions doesn't prevent this mass to resist the change of the nature. So it just loosens the weight of itself. So speaking of which, the natural transition and the change of the quality or the weight of the materials, Gülşah's work is very much about this natural process of organic and inorganic things and how they are actually changing through time. So if you don't have anything to add before Gülşah starts.
Maybe something which can relate to your work as well. There's something very modern and non-modern about this. On one hand, it's quite modern because it tries to reason nature by setting a standard and organizing everything around that rule. But there's also something very non-modern about it because it actually does not make sense. It's illogical, or it kind of resonates the same thing which the humans did centuries ago. The weight standard before this, in pro-modern eras, was also fixed to a natural object. It was the weight of a certain core of a vegetable. Thus, I mean, it's practically the same thing. It's like equaling 1 kilogram to 1 liter of water. So maybe because your work also deals with that discontinuity or transformation, like the changing meaning, shape, size, or all the other qualities of objects throughout time. Maybe also you can relate to that as well.
Thank you. Thank you for the introductions. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the introductions. When I met Nicola last week to see the piece he did in the Anatolian weight collections, and then we were talking about these 2 separate phenomena, one being this change of the kilogram and the other one being this guy who was obsessed with calculating the weight of the internet. Then I went home and I was researching about how this kilogram model changed. And what I was mostly interested about was the intense and extreme measures that were taken to protect this object, how precious it was. So as you can see in this image, it is placed in 3 separate bell jars. and they're each sealed, and they all have a key. And on top of it comes 2 separate safes. And it's been stored in a basement in France since 1879, so ever since it was set as a standard. And then it has 3 separate keys. 2 of the keys are stored in France, where it is located, but one of the keys is located somewhere else. I couldn't find where, but like this also says something like they're really trying to protect it. And it was only removed from all of these vessels every 40 years to take it and compare it to the other standards around the world.
Now you also gave a little spoiler to the film that would be yeah. It's such an interesting film, and I really recommend you to watch.
And so apparently the procedure of removing it is also like they don't even do it with hands and gloves. They do it with a specific tool that is right next to it in the picture actually. And then this tool is covered with filter paper. So everything is done to minimize its interaction with the other elements in the world. So they're trying really hard to like prevent it and just isolate it. And I found this quite fascinating, the measure we take to control a certain matter by isolating it. And then this material is platinum and iridium alloy. And what these 2 metals share in common is that they're both really dense, they're really malleable, and they both have high corrosion resistance, and they're highly unreactive. So even in 2000 degrees Celsius, iridium doesn't corrode. And in fact, it's the metal which has the highest corrosion resistance. So they also picked the 2 metals that would collaborate with them the most. So that was interesting to me. Ever since I started making art, I've been interested in this urge to control matter that we have as a species, to shape it, to manipulate it in the ways we want. And for the past 2 years, I've been working on a series of work called Operators from the Cambrian onwards. And within this work, what I've been doing mostly is to look at the ways we manipulate not only matter, but also time. Different tools and devices we develop in order to save some time, make something last longer than it would actually. And those things are so abundant, and they're such a big part of our daily life that we don't even think about them in relationship to time anymore. Like freezers, refrigerators, things that we use to make something's life longer. Or some pills that we take on a regular basis, like vitamin C pills. You would never have gotten that much vitamin C pill if you just ate regular food. And also this material that is called silica gel, which sounds foreign, but it's actually everywhere. Also, when you buy a leather good or electronic equipment, there's usually these tiny packages in it, and it says "do not eat." So it's basically a chemical product, silicium dioxide, and what it does is it absorbs the moisture and makes the other material live longer. So in a way, it's giving life to the other one by preventing decay. So I've been looking at these at one hand, and these are called, I've been defining them as time manipulators, and they also obviously manipulate duration. And on the other hand, I've been interested in materials that merge themselves into another thing and create a new temporality by doing that. So not only interacting, but also collaborating. So things like yeast in several different fermentation processes, it turns into this whole other timing, or vinegar in pickling processes, or this material called agar gel that is used for facilitating growth in bacteria. So I've been interested in these things, mostly because I'm also interested in this long-lasting preoccupation we have with ephemerality. We've been inventing so many, I'm sure you guys know much more versions of it, design objects to save some time. And there's a whole anti-aging industry today just for it. So I've been interested in that and working mostly around that. And the other thing that interests me is this hierarchy we have between us and the matter that surrounds us. Like, for example, with the case of the kilogram, we often position ourselves like superior to the matter that we define as inanimate. And we sort of like think of ourselves as the person, as the species that are controlling the rest of the matter, whereas matter is shaping us. And there's a certain continuity that is almost impossible to ignore today with the climate change and its results becoming more apparent than ever. And so the other day when we met with Nicola, he was also talking about sand and then silicon, and this silicon being also in these chips and cables, electronic equipment. In that sense, it also being part of this immaterial world that is created by the internet. So I was like, silicon is the second most abundant element in the Earth. It forms almost 24% of the Earth's crust, and then like it's basically everywhere. And we, as a regular human body, has 5 to 10 grams of silicon, so not that much. But today, people are paying tons of money to get it inserted into their bodies. So I find that interesting as well. Something that is so abundant, like you try to get it in your body so much. And so I'm interested in how the same element manifests itself in my body, in other species, but also in matter that we define as inanimate, like define as object, dead matter. And I'm interested in this continuity we tend to ignore many times. And silicon also happens to be structurally very similar to carbon. And because of this, scientists have actually really investigated if it can be a life source or not. I mean, it turned out that it can't, but it was the closest thing to carbon that can be a life source. So because of this, when I'm working in the studio, I'm interested in creating the studio environment as a non-hierarchical environment between myself and the materials I'm working with. So whenever I do something to a material, I try to like wait and observe how it's going to react, let it do its own thing. And of course, like some of these temporalities are going to outlive me, so I'm not going to see some of the effects, but I try to see what they want to do and then choreograph the rest of the work accordingly. And so this, the big K, the kilogram model, losing weight was for me kind of this fascinating manifestation that like no matter how much we try to like designate ourselves as the like mentor, as the main mind behind everything, matter finds ways to exert its own agency. And yeah, I think I'm going to stop here.
Yes, it's quite interesting in back to weight actually, and its relation to natural objects. We don't want to classify objects as natural ones and unnatural ones, but the standardization of food in the beginning is actually brings something else with it, which is grading. So you take objects, food, fruits or vegetables, and you standardize them and you grade them. And while doing this grading, you're actually doing it according to their physical qualities, like weight, shape, color, size, smell, and other smell sometimes. What Marco de Ramo argues in his book, The Pig and the Skyscraper, is this brings, I mean, this kind of takes all the essential taste out of these objects or food. Like if you look at apple, or if you look at an egg and standardize it and grade it through its physical qualities, the taste does not matter anymore. Maybe I kind of want to direct this question to you, like how do you see this kind of meta standardization and regulation of objects and then their relation to daily life experiences and quotidian ways of living?
I mean, I kind of think as all these standards serving a purpose of like getting rid of uncertainty, because uncertainty is like really anxiety provoking, and like humans try to get rid of uncertainty as much as possible, especially in creating certain precise industries and things. Also just in regular daily life, you don't want to, like, if you're starting something, even if it's cooking a cake, you don't want uncertainty there that you're going to end up with this horrible cake. You want to make sure it's going to work. So for me, standards serve for this purpose. When I'm making something, I usually repeat the same process several times, and it always ends up with different results, because I try to make sure like it's having a different light, it's having a different like. I mean, I don't try for this. This already happens on its own by nature. But to me, it's interesting. And definitely related, inherent to this problem we also have with uncertainty in systems.
So as an institute, actually, we're dealing with all kinds of daily objects. We treat them as if they are found treasures. And in connection with the museum's collection here, we came up with this idea that the collection of the museum itself is actually the most probably the banalist objects of their times, because they were how do you say they're quite useful in their life.
No one was thinking that like a 1 gram weight would be very valuable in 200 years.
Yeah, and they're almost like this bone. You can just put it on your packet and you just weigh things on your way, etc. So this kind of physical objects, the materials that we found both in the collection and also the processes of your work indicates that. The interconnectedness of everything, let's say, the processes of the matter connects with a certain quality of a physical matter, or the video that you show, the collection of the excerpts from certain videos, a shark underwater or a snake flying, etc. So these are all in link with this this holistic view of evaluating design objects or the environment. So would you like to say something about this idea of using the banalist things in your artworks?
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, relating these to also the idea of like collecting stuff, so like somehow, finding something that you feel somehow fascinated by, and you want to appropriate, or like you want to have a relationship with these objects or species or broken parts or like natural parts. I think, I mean, for me it's quite important to have that phase in which I sort of accumulate things, and then I slowly start to make a selection, and I start to create a relationship within images or objects. And I think for me it's quite important to also, I think, in this idea of like interconnection between things, somehow to have a sort of negation of the fact that something is done by me and something is found. So I accumulate objects that I found, but also like produce parts, but then I kind of like to see this sort of collection as something that there is no really separation about, between what I've done and what I found, and then like, in a sense, fall in love again with something that I've done, but somehow losing the fact that I own it because I made it. I'm not that much interested in that. And I think why you sort of collect something or you select something, I think it's a matter of recognizing. I think, like, recognizing.
Actually, it's two questions: why we are collecting and how we are collecting things.
Yeah, I think why it's really about the fact that you recognize a certain like atmosphere. I mean, for me at least, atmosphere or like or linked to something else. But I think it's really about almost like I guess finding a person that you feel like for some reason close to. You feel that there is something that you can share. I think with objects probably the same. So it's recognizing a certain level of comfort with something, and so I think this is. I mean, sometimes you also collect because you don't have enough money to produce work, so you need to kind of recycle things. No, but I don't think this is the case. I think it really has to do with like falling in love with something, and I don't know. I'm not really spend much time like wondering why. I mean, I don't collect like a series of specific like objects coming from related to a specific context. It can be like something like that I found and something that I buy or something like that. So I think it's but I think it's really about this idea of recognizing some sort of atmosphere that you want to keep with you and then somehow do something with it. I don't know.
Sometimes, I mean, you said it as a joke, but sometimes it is the case.
Yeah.
For example, Joseph Cornell was living in New York and he was really poor. He didn't have any money to buy a canvas or anything. So thus he just collected stuff from like Long Island and all around New York, and then brought them together into these things called shadow boxes. For him, it was really out of necessity and not having money. I also take the question for ourselves: why do we collect? I mean, in our case, we have this accumulation of same type of objects. Like one parameter is fixed there, whether it can be eggs or it can be timekeepers, time displays, or it can be function. I think it helps you, in our case, to create a debate from that accumulation. These are all objects which you have all around you. So by themselves, they don't mean anything. A park meter or a fondant or I don't know,
kitchen
an okra peeler or onion cutter or whatsoever. But once you bring them together under a specific name or under a specific issue, then it kind of induces a certain thought process of people experiencing it. It's not like having them all around you, like they are coming together creates a different thought process. And I want to turn this into a question. Maybe you can answer this both. As an artist, you are like, maybe there are two types of working. One is you have this empty canvas in your head, and you start to work on a topic, and you're like not much restrictions or limitations of either medium or theme or whatsoever. On the other hand, you can work with a collection or through that collection. What kind of a difference does it make to? Is it more liberating to have that kind of limitation, or is it does it kind of like force something upon you? Or even you can say maybe something about being in a physical place to work, because in your video we also see that you do not only interact with the collection itself, but the place where the collection is.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think like before I used to work like more like in this way of like projects, let's say, so like focusing on a specific conceptual idea and framework and develop something that was somehow kind of conceptually readable. And I think lately I'm quite happy with this. I think the work became a bit more subjective, so in a sense relying on some sort of like background preoccupations and concerns and whatever theoretical context, but I think I'm way more interested in somehow not having that clear definition so that you can always like read, okay, this is this because of that and because of that. No? So I think dealing with this collection particularly, I think it was quite interesting in this phase for me because I could somehow bring these two things together. So having this context, speculate on that context, but also, as you were talking about, as part of the space, which was still a quite subjective relationship with it, somehow also like related to some dreams I had after visiting the collection. But I think, so I don't know, for me I think the best is to somehow try to bring these two different approaches together. So somehow dealing with this emptiness or to do it very subjective questions, and then try to see how this question can engage with a fixed context. I don't know if I answered your question, but...
And Gülşah, in your works, you're collecting things and their different phases, but also the duration. Somehow we can say that you're a collector of duration and observant of these different different phases. Do you collect other things, or how do you relate with this idea of collecting or accumulating different qualities in your work?
Well, I've been trying not to collect because at a certain point in time, my studio sort of turned into a hoarder's house. Like, because I was working with a lot of materials, people were bringing, I think you might find this interesting, and then it ended up being a huge issue.
Because that happens when people start collect stuff for you. It's a quite interesting thing.
And when I was moving my studio, I decided, like, I'm not going to do that. And now, like, it doesn't start from a collection when I start working, but it starts from a correspondence and a curiosity. Like, for example, there was a point that I was really curious about toothpaste. Then I started collecting several different types of toothpaste, experimenting with it. And at a certain point, like, even our car was smelling like toothpaste.
Which is made of marbles and lots of them. Which is also quite another thing.
I mean, I was interested in it as like this thing that you interact at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, almost like a parenthesis. So it's usually things that I interact with on a daily basis, but then I'm just like really curious about it. So then I take it and like transform it into something else. But then there's always these durations that are happening, and some of them happen during the duration of the exhibition. So you get to see the change that happened in the exhibition and the works. But I like this term, being a collector of duration, because like, for example, with this work I was doing recently, it was coming from this process of pigment production from copper. So actually when you put vinegar and copper in the same jar, but they shouldn't be touching each other, then the interaction between them creates this beautiful blue pigment. And like when it gets a certain degree of daylight, it starts growing these crystals. And they're actually really beautiful. But this is another thing like I can't control. Like in some places I have shown this work, it really loved the daylight there and grew a lot of crystals. And in some places it just didn't happen. But like after the exhibitions, I come to the studio and I like watching their durations and recording them and like not knowing how it's going to end up, because like it's also possible that they will carbonize so much and they will become black. But I like this tension of like, this is also a challenge to myself because I'm human and I have this desire to control and I want it to stay as beautiful as it is. So it's also a challenge to myself in that sense, this duration thing.
It's a negotiation process between the work you intend and the work itself.
Okay. What you said before, I'd like to emphasize it again, that the whole world is in some kind of a frenzy to deal with the ambiguity of the world. So this is why maybe we have all kinds of like standards and like fixations on size and measures and everything, because the other side, the taste of something, you cannot really standardize it because everything is so both ambiguous and so relative
To some degree.
yes.
Yeah.
And also I think it also has this source, in kind of a spiritual source, that we don't want things to be undefined. We want everything to be like categorized and fixed. This not knowing something, not being able to even name something, creates this restlessness. Thus, we collectively work towards this definition and identification of things. And also I see in the both in design works or in commerce or in arts and whatsoever, we see there is this overemphasis on the importance of the human beings. Maybe this is why we are having new types of philosophies which give like equal importance to humans and non-humans, animate things and inanimate things, or calling everything objects, calling everything kind of hyper object. So maybe it's time seeing what the planet has come to environmentally and geologically. Maybe it's time to kind of realize that we are important, we give value to ourselves, we have self-value, but at the cost of being didactic. I want to say we are not too important or too valuable than any other thing we have around us. And in your artistic practices, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I see this very kind of relaxed or easygoing attitude towards your subject. You present your work not as being like very unique or very too valuable or too not to be touched, or the materials you are working with, your attitude, your way of exhibition kind of has this natural relation to your immediate environment. Do you agree or?
Yeah, I do agree.
No way.
I mean about this sense that we are not so important. I think it's a sort of liberation in a sense. Like really, I think it's quite useful. I think to think about several things, and about this aspect of the work. Well, I mean, sometimes you take the risk to do that as well. But I mean, it also depends on the context. No, I'm saying this because, like in this case, which is a museum, and like some parts have been already somehow of my installation have been somehow already like little broken because of this interaction, and they are not meant to. But I think it's quite interesting to see what's happening, you know. But yeah, I agree with the fact that I don't know. In general, I think what I do, I think it's really something that I don't know. I think I do mainly for myself, and then trying to communicate that. So sometimes I'm quite fascinated by really putting something out there that might not have enough definition, or maybe it's not clear exactly what it is, without having this celebration of it, putting it on a print or exactly on a wall. And I think I'm very interested in also going back to what you were saying, having this quite strong dialogue between, I think, the work and the space that the work is inhabiting. So, yeah.
I guess like I always try to choose things that are not so precious, and they're kind of like abandoned things that most of us have at our homes. like, for example, with this work with the copper, a few people came to the show and they were like, "Oh, so I can do this at home?" Yeah, you can do this at home. Like,
Too late.
Do you want the recipe? Yeah. So I am interested in this like non-preciousness, and as Nicola said, it also always comes with this uncertainty. Like with certain works, for example, people want to touch it, like because it doesn't have this like preciousness, but then they can damage it. So it always comes with a cost. But I like this feeling that like when making sculpture or installation, it doesn't have to be this like precious and like rare materials, and you can just look at the things that are around you through a different lens and then see different properties of them. And even these discussions we're having today about like being anthropocentric, how do we define things? I mean, those things have always been lying around. It's just that we're facing consequences today, so it's becoming an urgent issue. So I like that mundaneness of the materials and like seeing something that you almost ignore because it's always there through a different lens.
So,
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.